Hey, quick question. When's the last time someone brought up Vibe Ribbon in a conversation? What about Tokyo Jungle, Puppeteer, Brave Fencer, Musashi? Yeah, that's what I thought. PlayStation has been around for over 30 years, and in that time, Sony has published, co-published, or simply allowed some of the most creative, weird, beautiful, and flat-out bizarre games ever made. And a huge chunk of them completely forgotten. Not because they were bad, not because people didn't love them, but because industry moves fast, and the next big sequel always shows up, and some games just slip through the cracks. Today, we're pulling them back out. We're going through 4 distinct PlayStation eras, the PS1 all the way to the PS4, and spotlighting 3 games per era that deserve way more conversation than they're getting. Some of these you might have a dusty memory of, some you might have never heard at all. Either way, by the end of this video, I guarantee you'll be adding at least one game to a list somewhere. Let's get into it. Era 1, the Pioneer Era, PlayStation 1. Okay, imagine it's the mid to late 90s, 3D gaming is brand new. Nobody really knows what they're doing. Developers are just guessing, throwing mechanics at the wall and seeing what sticks. Polygons were a novelty, load times were an agony, and memory cards cost more than they should have. And yet, somehow, out of that beautiful chaos came some of the most creative games ever conceived. Because when nobody knows the rules, nobody's breaking them.
Oh, I'm busy, you know?
Brave Fencer, Musashi. Let's start with a game that should have been a franchise. Brave Fencer Musashi came out in 1998, published by Square. Yes, that Square. The same people who are simultaneously working on the Final Fantasy games. And in a lot of ways, Musashi feels like what happens when the people making serious JRPGs decide to make something completely unhinged. You play as Musashi, a tiny, foul-tempered miniature samurai hero who gets summoned by a princess to save the kingdom of all you can eat. And right off the bat, before the game even gives you a chance to breathe, she gets kidnapped. So your whole mission starts as a rescue, and just keeps getting more layered from there. Gameplay is a real-time action RPG. Think a slightly jankier, more chaotic Zelda. And what made it special was the assimilation mechanic. Musashi had 2 swords. One can absorb enemies' abilities, almost like a platformer take on Kirby. The other was for raw combat. That combination gave the game a surprising amount of depth for something that looked like a cartoon. But honestly, what people remember most is the vibe. Writing was funny, the characters had actual personality, towns had a real sense of life, NPCs even had sleep schedules. They reacted to the events of the world, the kingdom felt like a place that existed beyond just your mission. Brave Fencer Musashi sold reasonably well. Got a sequel on PS2 called Musashi Samurai Legend, which ironically most people remember even less. And then just nothing. The franchise quietly retired. Given the current nostalgia wave Square Enix has been riding, this is exactly the kind of IP that deserves a comeback. It's got personality, charm, and a game design philosophy that still feels fresh. Someone at Square, if you're watching this, please. Future Cop LAPD 1998. Future Cop LAPD came out in 1998 from EA, back when EA was still occasionally making interesting things. And it put you in control of a transforming police mech in the near future Los Angeles. The concept alone should have made this a household name. The mech could switch between 2 forms, a walking bipedal robot for tight spaces and targeted fire, and a hover car for faster movement across larger zones. Each mode had its own weapons, its own feel, and the game had this gorgeous blend of third-person shooter chaos with almost tower defense elements in certain modes. Here's the part people forget. It had a 2-player co-op mode and a competitive multiplayer mode that was surprisingly well designed. In the competitive mode, both players are trying to push waves of units toward the other player's base while also fighting directly. It played like a mashup between twin-stick shooter and early real-time strategy game, which in 1998 was a genuinely novel idea. The campaign had real variety too. You weren't just blasting through generic levels. You're in Venice Beach, you're in a Coliseum. You're carving through downtown LA against increasingly absurd threats. The game had a dark, satirical edge to it. Crime had gotten so bad that in this feature, the LAPD just deployed military-grade mechs, which honestly feels less like science fiction than it used to. Future Cop got solid reviews. It got positive word of mouth and then just never got a sequel. It never even got a proper HD re-release. It exists now as a PS1 relic that people occasionally bring up in the most underrated PS1 game threads, collect their upvotes, and then disappear. This one deserved more. Vibe Ribbon 1999. If you know, you know, and if you don't know, buckle up. Vibe Ribbon is one of the most conceptually pure games ever made. Developed by Nana Onsha, the same team behind Parappa the Rapper. It's a rhythm game where you guide a wireframe rabbit named Vibri along a track generated from music. Press buttons in time with the beat, and you literally sing as you play. Vibri degrades when you miss, and Vibri evolves when you nail it. Here's what made it legendary. The entire game fit on a single disc loaded into RAM. That meant you could swap the disc out and play the game to your own music. In 1999, on a PS1, you could put any CD you owned and Vibri would generate a level for it. This was a genuinely groundbreaking idea that the industry didn't really catch up to until procedural generation started getting trendy a decade and a half later. And it was wrapped in this minimalist, scratchy, almost lo-fi visual style that felt intentional and artful rather than limited. Here's the wild part. Vibri never came out in North America during the PS1 era. It was Japan and Europe only. American players who wanted to play it had to import it. Sony America passed. They didn't think it would sell. Then, in 2014, 15 years later, it quietly appeared on the North American PlayStation Store as a part of PS1 Classics Revival. Almost without fanfare. No marketing push. It was just there. Vibri is the kind of game that makes you realize how narrow game design can get. It proved that a game could still be built around a simple, elegant mechanic and still be profound. It's short, it's simple, it is completely, irreducibly itself. There is nothing else like it. Era 2, the experimental era. PlayStation 2. The PS2 era was something else. This was the age of weird peripherals, bold art directions, cult classics that weren't quite big enough to stay in the cultural conversation, but were too good to ever truly die. Developers had gotten comfortable with 3D. They understood the hardware, and a certain subset of them decided to use that comfort to get really weird. This era gave us Ico, Shadows of Colossus, Katamari Damacy, and for every one of those that became a legend, there were several others that landed just outside the spotlight. These are 3 of them. Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus, 2002. Wait, Sly Cooper, isn't that one remembered? Sort of. Ask someone to name PS2 platformers and they'll probably say Jak and Daxter, or Ratchet and Clank first. Sly tends to come 3rd or 4th, and then the sequels get even more obscured. The franchise as a whole has been basically dormant since Sly Cooper Thieves in Time in 2013. Which is a shame because Sly Cooper had something genuinely distinct. Sucker Punch's creation was a stealth action platformer built around this idea that Sly was a thief. And a good thief doesn't brawl his way through problems. He sneaks. He reads the environment. He picks his moments. The levels were designed around this philosophy. Guards had patrol patterns, vantage points mattered, you were rewarded for playing elegantly rather than aggressively. The presentation was stunning for its time, a cel-shaded aesthetic that looked like a Saturday morning cartoon brought to life, voice acting that actually had charm, and a heist movie structure where each chapter built toward a big score. Sly had his cane, his gang had their skills, and the team's dynamic between Sly, Bentley, and Murray gave the game a sense of personality that a lot of platformers of the era lacked. The sequels expanded the formula beautifully. Sly 2 in particular is frequently cited as one of the best games of the entire PS2 library, but the series never broke through to Jak or Ratchet levels of mainstream recognition, and after a 4th entry and a leaked film project that never materialized, it's been quiet. Sly Cooper deserves to be in the conversation whenever people talk about the PS2's best, because it absolutely belongs there. The Mask of Kree, 2002. This one is genuinely obscure, and that's a crime. The Mask of Kree was developed by San Diego Studio, an internal Sony team, and it combined 2 things nobody expected to go together. A thick, painterly art style inspired by Polynesian and indigenous artistic traditions, and a brutal, extremely violent combat system. You play as Rao, a massive warrior with a small bird companion named Kuzo. Kuzo is how you scout ahead. You send the bird out, it marks enemies, and then you engage with full knowledge of where everyone is. It's a simple mechanic, but it made the combat feel more tactical than chaotic. And the combat itself was genuinely clever. You used the right analog stick to target individuals around you, and the different face buttons executed different attacks. Against one enemy, you could chain elegantly. Surrounded by 3, it became a real-time puzzle of timing and positioning. The contrast between the art style, which was warm, almost sacred looking, with rich colors and flowing designs, and the absolute violence of the gameplay, created this fascinating tonal tension. The game looked like a children's storybook and played like a very serious action title. It sold modestly, got a sequel called Rise of Kanshi in 2005 that expanded the story, and then the series just ended. No revival, no remake. The games aren't even easily accessible digitally. If you can track down the Mark of Kree somehow, do it. It's one of the most visually distinctive games that PS2 produced, and the combat still holds up. Gregory Horror Show 2003. Okay, this is the wild card. Gregory Horror Show started as a CGI anime series in Japan, unsettling little vignettes about a hotel run by a bizarre skeletal mouse called Gregory, populated by guests who are all strange, monstrous, deeply unnerving creatures. The series had this quiet nightmare quality to it, the kind of horror that doesn't scream at you but just sits beside you and stares. The PS2 game adaptation is exactly that. You play as a soul who has gotten lost in Gregory's house and needs to collect the souls of other guests to escape. The gameplay is closer to a stealth adventure than anything else. You have to move through the hotel, observe routines, avoid being seen, and strategically retrieve souls without getting caught. Get caught too many times and you fail. The real hook was the cast. Each guest had their own schedule, their own personality, their own way of being terrifying. There's Cactus Gunman, who wanders the halls and will shoot you on sight. There's Hell's Chef, who operates out of the kitchen. There's Judgment Boy, who forces you into moral dilemmas. Each soul retrieval feels like a small puzzle built around understanding that character. Gregory Horror Show is one of those games that feels like it was made for a very specific audience that mostly didn't find it. It's horror without gore, unease without jump scares, and it has a visual and tonal identity that nothing else in gaming has really replicated before or since. It never got a sequel. The anime itself is obscure outside of Japan, and the game sits quietly in the corners of PS2's collector culture, waiting to creep someone out. Era 3, the HD era, PlayStation 3. The PS3 era changed everything about what games were supposed to look like. Graphics got real. Developers started chasing movie-quality aesthetics, motion capture, cinematic cutscenes, realistic lighting, and a lot of them thrived in that environment. But some of the most interesting titles from this era went against the trend. They were theatrical, stylized, experimental. They looked like the directors had real artistic visions rather than the benchmark targets. Naturally, these games got buried under Uncharted sequels and military shooters. Here are 3 that shouldn't be forgotten. Puppeteer 2013. Puppeteer is one of the most visually creative games Sony ever published. Full stop. Developed by Japan's studio and directed by Gavin Moore, it presented itself as a puppet theater performance. The entire game takes place on a literal stage, complete with curtains, spotlights, a live audience that reacts to what's happening, and a narrator who comments on the action in real time. The aesthetic wasn't just cosmetic, it informed the level design. The enemy design, the humor, the pacing, everything felt like it was built for the stage. You play as Kutaro, a boy whose soul has been captured by the Moonbear King and turned into a puppet. The Moonbear King eats his head, and the game's entire mechanic is built around the fact that Kutaro keeps finding replacement heads. Each one grants a different ability, and losing your head mid-level is a real obstacle. The gameplay itself was imaginative, a 2.5D platformer with a magic pair of scissors as your primary tool, capable of cutting through enemies, platforms, and environmental elements. Levels required you to think about what could be cut and when, which gave the game a satisfying tactile quality. The writing was sharp and theatrical. The visuals were among the most artistically ambitious of the entire PS3 library, and it sold terribly. Released in September 2013, right as the PS4 was looming, it fell through the cracks completely. Puppeteer never got a sequel. It's not even available digitally anymore, as of this recording, which is borderline criminal. If you find a copy, it's a game worth playing for the sheer audacity of its presentation. Folklore 2007. Folklore was a PS3 launch-era game that deserves to be a flagship franchise. Developed by Game Republic and published by Sony Japan Studio, it was a dark fantasy action RPG set in an Irish coastal village where the line between the living world and the underworld, called the Netherworld, has collapsed. You play as 2 characters, with separate but intertwining storylines. Keats, a journalist, and Ellen, a young woman searching for her mother. Their perspectives on the same events diverge in ways that gradually reveal a much larger, darker truth. The premise was gorgeous. The visual design was unlike anything else on the platform. Deeply influenced by Celtic folklore, fairy tale imagery, and a color palette that felt like stained glass filtered through fog. The character designs were incredible. Gameplay involved hunting creatures called folk and absorbing their powers. You could hold up to 4 powers at a time, swapping between them mid-combat, which gave fights a real rhythm. The PS3's 6-axis motion controls were used to literally pull powers out of the defeated enemies by jerking in the controller, which was actually satisfying in practice, unlike most 6-axis implementation. Folklore had a quiet, melancholy atmosphere that didn't fit comfortably into any existing game genre box, which might be part of why it didn't find a massive audience. It wasn't action-y enough for action fans, not systems heavy enough for RPG fans, and the story's deliberate pace required patience. It has a small but devoted cult following. It never got a sequel. It is one of the most underappreciated PlayStation Sony exclusives ever made. Tokyo Jungle 2012. Picture this. Humans have disappeared from Tokyo. Animals have taken over the city. You are a Pomeranian. Survive. Tokyo Jungle is one of those games where the concept is so absurd and specific that either immediately grabs you or it doesn't. There is no middle ground here. Developed by Crispies and published by Sony Japan Studio, Tokyo Jungle is a survival game where you play as animals, dozens of them, from Pomeranians and Beagles to lions, deer, raptors, and eventually stranger and stranger options. Trying to survive in an overgrown, post-human Tokyo, you eat, you reproduce, you mark territory. You slowly uncover the mystery of where all the humans went through environmental storytelling and unlockable archive records. The gameplay loop is deeply compelling in a roguelike way. Each run is different. Starvation and predators are constant threats. The city is divided into zones with escalating danger. Playing as herbivores versus carnivores requires completely different strategies. And the meta progression, unlocking new playable characters and new story chapters, gives you reasons to keep going even after you fail. What made it remarkable was the tonal mixture. It's darkly funny. It's unexpectedly poignant. The mystery of what happened to humanity is doled out with a genuine craft. And the whole thing is wrapped in a trashy B-movie visual aesthetic that somehow works perfectly. Tokyo Jungle got a PC port and a digital release and developed a solid cult following. But it's still one of those games that most people have never heard of and that almost nobody talks about in mainstream PlayStation discourse. It is a singular experience. There's nothing else like it. Era 4, the refined era, PlayStation 4. The PS4 era was dominated by giants. God of War, Spider-Man, Horizon, The Last of Us Part 2. These games were massive, technically stunning, culturally enormous games, and they absolutely deserve the attention they got. But in their shadow, a handful of smaller or simply less marketed games got quietly lost. Not because they failed artistically, but sometimes just because the timing was wrong, or the budget was lower, or Sony just simply didn't push them the way they pushed their biggest tentpoles. Here are 3 that got lost in the shuffle. Gravity Rush 2017. If you played the original Gravity Rush on PS Vita, you already know why this franchise deserves more. Gravity Rush 2, developed by SIE Japan Studios Team Gravity, takes everything that made the first game special. Kat's ability to redefine gravity and fall in any direction she chooses, and expands it into a full PS4 production with a bigger world, richer story, and genuinely breathtaking visual design. Kat is one of the best PlayStation protagonists ever created. She's cheerful, impulsive, deeply compassionate, and powerful in ways that feel tied to who she is as a person. The gravity mechanics, where you shift your personal gravity to fall upward, sideways, or at any angle through the city, felt completely unlike any other movement systems in games. Traversal was pure joy. The world, Neo Paris meets floating island aesthetic, was gorgeous. The story, which dealt with Kat's uncertain origins and the forces trying to control or destroy her. The game ended on a moment that hit harder than a lot of games with 3 times the budget. And then the servers got shut down in 2018, shutting off DLC and online features, and then Team Gravity was dissolved. The series director left to start his own studio. Gravity Rush 2 sold well enough to be considered commercially decent, but not well enough to justify continued investment by Sony standards. It exists now as a PS4 exclusive that can't be played on PS5 via streaming, and has no confirmed path to a sequel. It is one of the best PlayStation games of the entire decade if you ask me, and the franchise's uncertain future is one of the most frustrating things in PlayStation's recent history. The Order 1886, 2015. Okay, I know what some of you are thinking. The Order 1886? Really? Yes, really. The Order 1886 had a rough launch. It was short, it had long, unskippable cutscenes. Some sections were more like interactive movies and games. Critics dunked on the price to playtime ratio, and that narrative became the one people remembered. But here's what got lost in that conversation. The Order 1886 was visually stunning in ways that hadn't been seen before on PS4. The letterbox presentation, the grain filter, a gaslit Victorian London recreated with meticulous detail. This was a production. Developer Ready at Dawn clearly had extraordinary artistic vision. The world was fascinating. An alternate history where the Knights of the Round Table had become an order of immortal warriors, defending humanity against half-bred creatures, werewolf-adjacent monsters, while also fighting a human rebellion. The characters had weight. The voice acting was excellent. The mythology was rich in potential. Tragedy of the Order 1886 is that it was clearly the first chapter of something larger, and it got burned for not being the complete thing. The game set up threads and never got to resolve. Ready at Dawn didn't get a second shot. The IP sits dormant at Sony. If the Order 1886 has been given the sequel that addressed the length and pacing criticism, more gameplay, more world, more story, it could have become one of PlayStation's iconic franchises. Instead, it's a byword for cinematic overreach. It deserved better than that reputation. Alienation 2016. And finally, one for the people who just want to shoot things really well. Alienation is a top-down twin-stick shooter from Housemarque. the Finnish studio that would later go on to make Returnal and get acquired by Sony. In 2016, they were still making lean, precise, arcade-influenced games for the PlayStation Store, and Alienation is one of their best. Earth has been invaded by aliens. You pick from one of the 3 classes, each with distinct playstyles and skills, and you fight through waves of increasingly overwhelming enemies to try and turn the tide. That's basically the pitch, but the execution is exceptional. Housemarque's signature is what I'd call readable chaos. Screen filling, enemy hordes, bullets everywhere, explosions constant, but designed in a way where you can always parse what's happening and react meaningfully. The loot system gave the game long legs. The co-op, local, and online made it better with friends. The difficulty curve was punishing in exactly the right ways. Alienation didn't get a massive marketing push. It launched at a budget price point at PSN and found an audience through word of mouth. It's the kind of game that gets called a hidden gem, and then people play it and go, wait, why didn't I play this sooner? With Housemarque's elevation in the PlayStation ecosystem after Returnal, maybe Alienation will get a second look. It absolutely earned one. That's 12 games across 30 years of PlayStation history, and honestly, I could have kept going. The Pioneer era alone has another 10 games worth this kind of deep dive. What makes PlayStation's catalog special isn't just the flagship titles. It's the breadth, it's the willingness, at least at certain points in history, to fund weird ideas, to let Japan's studio do experimental things, to publish games that didn't fit a template. Some of these games found their audiences, some didn't, but they're all still out there, waiting to be played or replayed or discovered for the first time. If any of these spark something, if you went, wait, I remember that, or I had no idea that existed, let me know in the comments. What games do you think got unfairly forgotten? I want to hear the picks I missed. Subscribe if you want me to keep exploring the forgotten and the fringe. There's a lot more where this came from. See you in the next one.